Hey everybody, welcome back. Thank you so much for tuning in to part 2 of this, the incidence or burden of the tax video, okay? So we're on per unit taxes, talking about the burden of the tax, and we're on to part 2, okay? In part 1, we showed that it didn't matter whether or not we shifted the supply curve or shifted the demand curve. Remember, shifting the supply curve is if the supplier is the one that physically pays the money to the government, or shifting the demand curve, that's when the consumer physically pays the money to the government. Doesn't matter who physically pays the money to the government, to who the true burden or incidence of the tax falls on. And here's where we really put I think it's called a ribbon on it, right? Is where we really show you, okay, what we want to take away from it. And the way that we're going to do this is with a tax wedge, okay? This is an instrument that here at Econ Busters we really like. Now, we don't want you to get mechanical with it. We want to make sure you understand it, okay? This is a typical tax wedge, how it's drawn. And what's super important is that the base of the tax wedge remains completely vertical, okay, completely vertical, and that you understand that this is hard clay. Why? Because this vertical distance right there is the sorry guys, that's not coming through really well, per unit tax, all right? So this vertical distance is the per unit tax, and what is it doing? It's separating the true price to the consumer and the true per unit revenue to the producer. Why? Because the government is getting this amount. So the amount that the consumer pays in total can't be the per unit revenue after the tax, okay? Because this is the per unit tax. As far as this area right here, I like to kind of say it's soft clay, okay? In fact, it's kind of nice just to see that it's kind of hollow right there. What I want you to understand is this vertical part of the tax wedge is always going to find its way snugly in between those two. If it's anywhere not there, the price will continue to flex until it finds its way there and QS equals QD. And we've got some good videos, or at least a good video, showing you how that works if you're confused by that. Okay, it's always going to find its way into there. And we're going to touch on that concept a little bit in this video. So, I'm going to actually switch sides. There's our per unit tax, okay? I've got this situation where PED is far less than PES. So PED, price elasticity of demand, is less. That means it's more inelastic, okay? The smaller the PED, the more inelastic, okay? PES, far more elastic. The PES value is far greater, okay? In this particular situation, we're about to see the consumer is going to take on a bigger burden of the tax. So we can just put that tax wedge in there, okay? Just push it in. Now, this base right there is going to tell us this is going to be Q tax after the tax is put into place. Let me go back to the original curves, okay? That's where the original curves are intersecting. I already marked price market, but let me get quantity market also. So what I want you to understand is pre-tax, we had quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Post-tax, when we get to Q-tax, the market is still going to clear, okay? Just because a per unit tax has been placed on the market doesn't mean that the market's not going to clear. In fact, it's going to clear, okay? This is actually called a market-based intervention because it's still allowing price to be flexible and output to be flexible, and they will continue to change or adjust until the market clears, until QS equals QD. I know that's a lot of words, but I promise all of that is important to fully understand this concept, okay? So I've got my tax wedge in. Now notice, at the top of my tax wedge, which curve am I hitting? I'm hitting the demand curve. So this gives me price consumer. Let me say that again, okay? The top of my wedge is touching my demand curve. I'm on my demand curve right there, hence price consumer. And that should make sense. Per unit taxes are going to raise the consumer's price, okay? Just to make sure that we've got this, guys. I already had PM, price market, pre-tax, all right, price put on the graph. Remember, this is where PC equaled PP. Before the per unit tax, price consumer equaled price producer, all right? Because the government wasn't giving or getting any money, so the amount the consumer paid was the per unit revenue the producer got. So PC equaled PP right here. Post-tax, price consumer goes up. Now I go to the bottom of the tax wedge, okay? I'm hitting the supply curve. So that is price producer, all right? This distance between PC and PP is the per unit tax. And we can see right off the bat, the price the consumer's price went up far more than the producer's per unit revenue or the producer's price went down. Remember, we can say either way. We can say the producer's price or the producer's per unit revenue. I just say them interchangeably to make sure that we remember that, right? Price to a producer is what they receive. Price to a consumer is what they've got to give up, okay? They're both upset. Consumer gives up more, producer receives less, but they're not upset the same amount. The consumer is incurring far more of the burden. Why? Because it comes back to this whole market clearing thing I was talking about earlier. QS and QD both had to decrease by that amount. QS and QD. Well, how much is QS and QD going to change? It's based on the elasticities of their curve. Take a look at the producer, okay? Far more responsive to the price change, okay? Price goes down just a little bit. If they're very responsive, right, more elastic, the more elastic, price goes down, they respond more. So for that little price change, we're getting that much QS decreasing. For the consumer, far more inelastic, okay? Less responsive to price changes. The price for the consumer, notice, starting at PM, the price for the consumer has to go up by that amount to get the same change in QD. That's the key. I hope you caught that. That's the part that you might want to rewind in the video, okay? Once again, QS and QD changing by the same amount. Now, we just want to finish this off, okay? Truly putting the ribbon on it, right? This amount, this triangle, that I'm now highlighting in red. I'm not triangle, don't know my geometry. Rectangle. This rectangle right there, that is the amount of revenue the government is collecting from this tax. Should make sense, okay? The vertical distance is the per unit tax. The horizontal distance is the Q tax, okay? So this vertical distance, they're getting, who's getting? The government's getting for every single one of them. So of course we're getting a rectangle, we're not getting a triangle. It only makes sense that it's a rectangle, okay? So there's my tax revenue in total. Now I'm gonna go back, I'm gonna use a different color right here. I'm gonna grab blue, okay? And put that PM right there. So this rectangle, total revenue collected by the government. The top rectangle, blue to red, that's the amount of the revenue the government got that the consumer paid. That's the amount of revenue the government got that the consumer paid. Blue down to this bottom red right here, blue down to the bottom red. This rectangle is the amount of the revenue that went to the government that the producer paid, okay? So let's go ahead and put this in. This is the consumer's burden, and that's what we're talking about. This is the producer's burden. So who paid more of the revenue to the government? Who paid more of the tax revenue in total to the government? The consumer did, because they were more inelastic. Notice, I didn't even shift the curve. The wedge makes it so I don't even have to shift the curve. I get all the relevant things that I care about. I know where PC is, PP is in relation to PM. I know Q tax, I know QM. I got everything I needed. I got the consumer's burden, the producer's burden. I didn't have to shift a curve because the curve shifting is a cosmetic thing. It doesn't really change any of the economic outcomes that we get, okay? So hopefully that made a lot of sense to you, okay? There might be a few parts of that. Go back, listen to again. Make sure you've got them. The incidence of the tax. It falls on the one that's more inelastic. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in the next video.